Your particular someone is scared of what will happen when you realize they are, and they are shaking with fear. The moment your special someone saw your name on their phone, something clicked into place, and their expression transformed in a way that no one else could understand. For a brief moment, they grinned, but then it vanished as though they had just realized something they couldn't ignore. They silently locked the screen, turned to face the window, and inhaled deeply so that no one else could hear them. They weren't losing their emotions. They didn't want to leave. It was because they were aware that all they had been working so hard to conceal could be altered by a single revelation from you. Hold on to this, because in the next few moments, even the tiniest detail will show you why their confidence went so fast. The response is not what most people would anticipate. And as soon as you see it, all the odd moments start to come together like missing parts of a puzzle. The way people act when they are carrying a truth they aren't ready to speak out loud has an almost dramatic quality. After responding to messages, they delete them. They start a phone call, but they hang up before it even rings. They mentally replay conversations, wondering if one unintentional sentence has already disclosed too much. You don't realize how long your special someone has been residing inside that silent strain. They constantly asking themselves one question, which makes every regular moment seem significant to them. If they eventually figure it out, what will happen? That's the question that has followed them everywhere, at work, on long trips, while they pretend to laugh with friends, even in the quiet times when no one is around. However, this is the plot twist that completely alters the narrative. It's not a disgraceful secret that they are afraid you will discover. It's something very intimate that has the power to change all of your preconceived notions about how far apart you are. Observe one thing that practically everyone overlooks before this narrative continues. Not all fear stems from anticipating rejection. It can occasionally result from having such high expectations for acceptance that the prospect seems overwhelming. They were staring at an old chat that you probably forgot ever took place late one evening. It wasn't a grandiose admission. It wasn't a speech that changed people's lives. Just a few straightforward words that stuck with you both much longer than you had anticipated. They repeatedly attempted to ignore the awareness that those remarks marked the beginning of. Since then, every look, every chance meeting, and every quiet moment spent together has taken on a new significance for them. They have been afraid, not because you might find something horrible, but rather because you might find out who they really are underneath each cautious choice and guarded smile. They no longer know how to show their gentler sides without feeling totally exposed since they have spent so much time projecting an image of strength. And now more than ever, an unforeseen event is bringing that secret truth to light. There's going to be a conversation. A time that neither of you anticipated is stealthily approaching your life. One query will at last get the response it has been waiting for when it arrives. And that explanation might be the reason your loved someone has been shaking at the idea of what you'll find out when you really get to see them. The period of silence was shorter than they had anticipated. Almost instantly, there was a slight change that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. They began listening more intently to even the slightest things you said, looking for hints that you might already be aware of the truth in each utterance. Suddenly, a casual smile from you was really powerful. A delayed response seemed like an enigma they were unable to shake. They had no fear of losing command of the situation. The amazing idea that the walls they had constructed were no longer concealing anything at all terrified them. They had to strike a balance every day between wanting you to see their heart for what it truly was and safeguarding it. Then something occurred that left them utterly uneasy. You unintentionally brought up a trait you find most admirable in people during a casual conversation: the guts to be true to oneself despite discomfort. You didn't hesitate to walk on, yet those words rang in their heads for hours. They came to see that what you valued most was also what they had been concealing. Their deepest anxiety started to give way to cautious hope in that moment. You won't want to miss this story's emotional turn before it takes another turn. Because it explains why every choice they make going forward feels unlike anything they've ever done. They sat by themselves that night, their screen displaying innumerable incomplete messages. There were 3 versions: one was truthful, the other was light-hearted, and the third pretended nothing had changed. They were all typed and then deleted. They envisioned every scenario. What if you grinned? What if you chuckled? What if you understood in silence and didn't require any clarification? Their heartbeat raced more quickly as a result of those thoughts than any dramatic event could. After resisting it for so long, they eventually came to terms with it. The risk of the truth did not make it fearful. Because it was real, it was terrifying. They had waited for a moment that never seemed to come, hiding behind flawless circumstances, flawless timing, and flawless words. However, life seldom waits for ideal circumstances. Occasionally, it subtly encourages 2 individuals to have a conversation that neither of them had planned but both of them secretly needed. If this tale has touched you, think about telling it to someone who thinks that genuine connections frequently start with unanticipated candor. Additionally, if you're loving the adventure, you won't miss where this incredible story takes you if you subscribe. Because there isn't a dramatic outburst of emotion that follows. It's more subdued and, in some way, even more memorable. When morning finally arrived, they had an inexplicable sense. Rather than fleeing the reality, they discovered that they were gradually getting ready for it. They had differing perspectives on the past. They reenacted seemingly insignificant situations that suddenly had deeper significance. They realized that all of their hesitations, anxious giggles, and contemplative pauses had been subtly pointing in the same direction. The moment that altered everything then arrived. A message from you flashed on their phone. Easy, cozy, and totally surprising. The words themselves lacked any dramatic quality. However, they brought the safety that your loved someone had been yearning for. For the first time in a long time, they asked a completely different question instead of, "What if they discover who I really am? What if learning the truth is precisely what unites us?" That one change turned anxiety into excitement. One more piece of the puzzle is still missing, though. They have never spoken out loud to anyone about it. Speaking those things would leave you with nowhere to hide, not because they don't trust you. And the next chapter starts at the exact moment they determine whether it is worthwhile to remain silent or whether the long-guarded truth is finally ready to speak. One chance meeting turned out to be the pivotal moment they never anticipated. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't intentional. It occurred during one of those typical situations that people tend to forget. A familiar location, familiar sounds, and familiar folks going in all directions. However, time seemed to pause the moment they noticed you. They had practiced this encounter innumerable times in their heads, thinking they would maintain composure, communicate organically, and keep all of their suppressed feelings at bay. Rather, all they had rehearsed silently vanished. They looked into your eyes, searching for a response you weren't even aware you had. Neither the speech nor the confession were flawless. There was merely a question-filled stillness during which neither of you spoke out loud. They saw something surprising in your gaze, a serene curiosity, as though you had long suspected that there was more to them that was just waiting to be discovered. They were unnerved in the most lovely way by that understanding. Maybe the truth had never been fully concealed. Maybe you had just been patient enough to wait for them to tell you. Remain around them since their next choice is no longer motivated by fear. It stems from an increasing conviction that honesty is more important than protection in your relationship. They stopped attempting to forecast every scenario for the remainder of that day. Rather, long before either of you realized it, they started to recall every little occasion that had subtly linked your life. The discussions that went longer than anticipated. The effortless laughing that came forth. Some meetings always seemed to happen by chance, although they were never really that way. It dawned on them that they were not haphazard recollections. They served as gentle reminders that sincere connection seldom makes a big show of itself. It develops by reliability, trust, and many small decisions that only make sense when taken as a whole. Then came another insight that was even more potent than the first. They realized that they had been shielding themselves from rejection all along. Since acknowledging the truth meant acknowledging that someone might genuinely care enough to recognize every flawed, ambiguous, and vulnerable aspect of who they truly were, they had been shielding themselves from happiness. It was a frightening and reassuring concept. One piece of this puzzle remains, lurking in the shadows. And when it's revealed, you'll see why every pause you've seen has a deeper significance than appearances could have ever indicated. They opened the note they had rewritten more times than they could remember as night fell. Something felt different this time. The moment was no longer controlled by the fear, though their hands were still a little unsteady. It merely served as a reminder that what they were going to do was important. They grinned to themselves as they peered out the window and came to terms with a reality that had been haunting them for far too long. Concealing their true selves had become far more taxing than disclosing them. Perfect words were no longer necessary. They didn't require the ideal time or location. All they had to do was have the guts to reveal the person who had been silently hiding behind each cautious smile from the start. And just as they were about to take that last step, a wholly unexpected detail, a lost memory, or an unanticipated discovery caused them to hesitate once more. It wasn't an excuse to back down. It served as motivation to consider even more thoroughly what this relationship might develop into once all the unanswered questions had been addressed. It won't just be what they've been waiting for you to find out in the next moment. It will reveal why that truth has the capacity to change all that comes after. Life presented them with one more silent test just when it appeared that the time had finally come. It wasn't a major roadblock or a miscommunication. It was far more illuminating. If you had one chance to be completely honest with the person who matters most, what would you say? Was a straightforward question that stuck with them long after the conversation was over. As they strolled through well-known streets, they were aware of features they had been ignoring for months. The glow of storefront lights, unreserved laughter amongst couples, and strangers lending a hand to one another without expecting anything in return. For the first time, they stopped worrying about the worst and started thinking about what may occur if they opted for bravery rather than caution. They came to understand that the fear that had kept them up had nothing to do with being found. It was about having nothing left to conceal. All of their justifications were silently vanishing. Every hour that went by made it hard to deny the realization that the truth had grown too powerful to keep quiet. Almost no one first notices this story's additional layer. And as it becomes clear, the journey's title starts to mean something very different. When they eventually took a seat to reflect, they discovered something that even they were startled by. It wasn't a weakness, an error, or something they wished they could forget about the secret they had been keeping. It was the intensity of their emotions and the frail individual those emotions had exposed. They had been acting so calm for so long that they had forgotten what it was like to just be real. You wouldn't think less of them, therefore they weren't afraid. They were afraid that you might at last realize how much room you had quietly taken up in their hearts all along. Every careful gesture, every delayed message, and every instance in which they were unusually silent suddenly made perfect sense. If this story has made you realize how powerful honesty can be, you might want to share it with someone who enjoys such poignant tales. Additionally, subscribing helps guarantee that you won't miss the conclusion if you want to stick around for what comes next. Because dramatic confessions won't be the focus of the next few moments. They are about a small choice that, without a big speech, has the potential to transform two lives. They took another look at your most recent communication as the evening came to an end. They didn't overanalyze every word this time. They didn't look for imaginary cautions or hidden meanings. Rather, they grinned genuinely, relieved of the burden they had been carrying for so long. At last, they realized what had been troubling them all along. They didn't care what you found out about them. They feared there would be no going back once you really saw them. Because being fully seen entails letting someone know your aspirations, uncertainties, quiet dreams, and the version of yourself that you haven't revealed to anybody else. However, they found themselves getting closer to that moment than ever before rather than receding away. Behind the scenes, one last surprise is already taking place. Furthermore, it isn't happening by accident. All of the buried emotions are about to be revealed by a single conversation, one surprising decision, and one sincere statement. When that time comes, you'll realize why your particular someone hasn't been avoiding the truth all along. They were mustering the bravery to allow you to join them permanently. Every memorable story has a point at which the weight of everything left unsaid becomes too much for silence to bear. That moment came out of nowhere for your loved someone. They weren't preparing a flawless confession or standing on a stage. When they realized they had expended more energy concealing their emotions than paying attention to them, they were just going about their daily lives. Everything was altered by that insight. They began to wonder how much longer they could live without disclosing the secret instead of how long they could keep it a secret. Each memory started to take on a new significance. All of a sudden, the conversations they had anxiously replayed became reminders of how kind you had always been to them. They were now finding quiet strength in the moments they had once feared. Then they had another unanticipated concept. What if you were already aware of it? What if every anxious grin, contemplative pause, and overly lengthy glance had already conveyed more information to you than words could? They were both alarmed and reassured by that possibility. There is one noteworthy fact that lies just beneath the surface of this story before it reaches its next pivotal moment. They have never really been able to break free from this bond because of this straightforward knowledge. Despite their best efforts, the solution was not concealed within a dramatic incident. It was concealed by consistency. Their thoughts somehow made their way back to you whenever things got hard. Every accomplishment felt unfinished until they imagined sharing it with you. Every challenging day felt easier when they recalled a supportive exchange you had once had. They gradually came to terms with something they had opposed for far too long. They were afraid you would find out that they had let you become a part of the future they secretly imagined. Not because they anticipated it, nor because they planned it. It just happened one routine moment after another until it was impossible to separate your presence from their dreams. They trembled at that realization, not in fear, but with the crushing knowledge that true emotions cannot remain concealed indefinitely. They were starting to question the need for the fortifications they had erected out of prudence. They had lost interest in shielding themselves from disappointment. Even if it meant plunging into uncertainty with nothing but honesty to guide them, they wanted to give hope a chance. They seemed to be creating room for the start of a new chapter as they opened the window and let the cool air fill the room as night fell once more. Something stronger and far calmer was gradually taking the place of the fear that had before accompanied every thought. At last, they realized that the biggest danger was not letting you find out who they really were. The biggest danger would have been to allow this remarkable bond stay hidden under unsaid feelings indefinitely. Another element of the narrative subtly came into place at that very moment. It was getting closer to an encounter that neither of you had anticipated. It was finally becoming inevitable to have the conversation that had been repeatedly postponed. The one sentence that your particular someone has never had the courage to express out loud is concealed within that impending conversation. The phrase that clarifies why they have been trembling with fear each time they envisioned you discovering the truth. You won't simply comprehend what they were concealing when those phrases are ultimately delivered. You'll see why disclosing it marks the start of everything they've secretly dreamed for.